all man's actions interact directly or indirectly with the natural environment and influence the delicate ecosystems that are present along the coast. This process, called anthropical pressure, is unfortunately very evident in the Ligurian Riviera. Ligurians, who were once used to living in the hinterland in order to face up to the frequent attacks originating from the sea, have occupied almost the entire coast over the last 50 years, building indiscriminately along 325 kilometers of coast. Little less than 60 kilometers remain unurbanized, of which only 7 kilometers represent the longest free strip of coast found between Camogli and Portofino. Yet, even more critical is the situation in the city of Genoa, where access to the sea has become practically impossible for many kilometers. The impressive creation of artificial cliffs or barriers in order to curb the erosion process and to stop the shoreline from moving backwards has provoked negative results, altering the movement of the coastal currents and, as a consequence, hindering the natural flow of deposits, which is essential for maintaining a well-balanced coastline. It is therefore clear that harbour works on a large scale, such as industrial harbours, as well as the much smaller tourist harbours, influence this natural phenomenon, increasing the coastal erosion process. This fierce urbanization has deeply modified the morphology of the Ligurian coast, and cementification, unfortunately, returns to the fore in the always more frequent cases of floods in the Ligurian area. Now, we cannot do much else but preserve those few kilometers still free of cement and, where possible, try to salvage the situation by way of renaturalization techniques. Apart from its negative impact on the landscape, urbanization also exercises further pressures on the natural environment. For example, the high production of solid waste, which is not always disposed of in a suitable way, and large amounts of urban waste, which throws tons of chemical substances into the sea. Fortunately, since the Ligurian Sea is open and deep and takes advantage of the tramontana winds which originate in the north, it tends to dissipate offshore pollution caused near the coast, and it still manages to maintain good self-purification levels. This limits the phenomena linked to the eutrophication process, like what recently occurred in the Adriatic, more commonly known as mucilage, which in the last few years has become evident in our waters. Air supply, in addition to water supply, can represent a very important means of transport for certain pollutant substances. 10% of all hydrocarbons which reach the sea do so via the air, and the quantity of polychlorobiphenyl, a highly toxic chemical substance used in oil, paint, plastic, and lubricant-producing industries, which reaches the sea in this way, is the same as the amount which is thrown into the sea from the main land. Another source of pollution, which concerns in particular hydrocarbons, is sea traffic. Over half of the petroleum extracted every year is transported via the sea, and more than 2 million tons of this ends up more or less accidentally in the sea. The drainage of water used for cleaning the tanks which carry petroleum constitutes another source of pollution, in addition to the very serious accidents, such as the recent one involving the oil tanker Haven. This is why Liguria and its sea has been declared to be the area of the Mediterranean most at risk of hydrocarbon pollution. Another form of pollution is linked to sea traffic, which is still not well known even by the experts, and that is the environmental impact caused by the anti-vegetative varnishes used to prevent fouling formation. Any object that is immersed in the sea, of any material, shape or size, is relentlessly attacked and covered by a layer of numerous marine organisms in the short or long term, which causes fouling and is to blame for many problems. The increase in the roughness of the hull for one, which leads to a drastic reduction in speed, higher fuel consumption, and an acceleration of the corrosion of its metallic parts. Apart from seacraft themselves, permanent structures immersed in the sea, such as cables, buoys, harbour plants, offshore platforms, and various kinds of equipment, are also subject to fouling and its consequences, which means that they could suffer a considerable loss of functionality and resistance. Many attempts have been made to limit the damage caused by these organisms. For example, the search for chemical substances which can slow down this settlement, which, when added to the varnishes, give an anti-vegetative or anti-fouling quality. However, main actives used are highly toxic and often contain heavy metals which remain in the environment afterwards, accumulating in the organisms via the food chain or plunging into the marine deposits. It's important to remember, by the way, that much human activity damages the environment and that everything, sooner or later, ends up in the sea, even if the source of pollution is hundreds of kilometers away. Tourism, which plays an important part in the Ligurian economy, provokes, on a seasonal basis, an extremely high increase in environmental inconveniences for our coastal shores. The great rise in the number of people present in particular determines a rapid and impressive increase in urban waste, subjecting the purifiers, when present and in working order, to often unbearable regimes. Tourism and the environment are compatible. It's only a question of intelligence and respect. You can enjoy the sea without degrading it, by keeping the limits of interaction with it in mind. It's possible to go to sea not as raiders, but rather as visitors who are aware of its value and of the irreplaceable moments, colours and emotions which the Ligurian Sea can still give us. This land facing the sea offers the less indifferent tourist an infinite number of opportunities to be in direct contact with the most classical atmosphere of the Mediterranean landscape. Professional fishing is amongst the human activity which puts great pressures on the environment of the Ligurian territory, which a few years ago started to count for over 1,000 of the boats present, about 5.6% of the national total. it has often unfairly been blamed for the biological impoverishment of the Ligurian Sea. Often restrictive regulations, the lack of naval ports, the absence of trading policies, and the pressures of EC regulations are causing the decrease in small-scale fishing in the Mediterranean. All the fishing methods known in Italy are practiced in Liguria, although with different systems and equipment which reflect the multicultural characteristic and the particular typology of our sea. The majority of the fishermen in the province of Genoa still practice small-scale fishing with boats that have a gross tonnage of less than 10 tons, and only 100 fishermen own power trawlers used for drag fishing or snare fishing. Although drag fishing is the most common method used in Italian marinas, it only counts for 10% in Liguria. It is practiced where the seafloor is muddy or sandy, and at depths between 50 and 700 meters. The net is made up of a sack which is hauled by the boat and kept open horizontally by a so-called divergent system, and vertically by a series of corks near to the surface and leads near the bottom. This type of fishing is considered to be the most dangerous. In fact, the ministry has imposed regulations regarding the use of a meshwork of 40 millimeters for the sack, as well as so-called periods of biological rest, when fishing activity must be suspended, yet which in Tirreno, in the last few years, have not been regularly respected. The type of fishing practiced in Liguria is, for the most part, multi-specific small-scale fishing, utilizing medium-sized boats which never go far away from the coast and carry different nets according to the season. Trammel nets and boaters are generally used everywhere because they require low investments and one or a maximum of 2 people can use them. Summer activity concentrates on capturing sardines and anchovies with very particular nets known as snare nets. This method is practiced at night with the aid of light sources to attract the shoals of fish. In the winter, the support boats to the mothercraft, known as chiari, are used for fishing with so-called trawl nets, one time dragged along the earth, but today it is anchored by capstans, which are directly on board. Trawl nets, which according to EC regulation should be abolished by 2001, represent the oldest tradition of Ligurian marinas. Recent studies carried out by an operative unit of the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry have demonstrated that unlike the dragnet, this kind of net does not plough the sea floor, nor capture species which live there, such as mullet, squid, etc. Another purely Ligurian characteristic are the permits that the fishermen can obtain from the 15th of January to the 15th of February for fishing sardines and anchovies when in the larval stage of development, more commonly known as whitebait. In past years, we have witnessed the impoverishment of our sea, and often fishermen have been accused of having fished too much and of being the cause of all the damage. Today, those who study the problems connected to fishing state that this activity is well below alarm levels in our sea, and unfortunately it is slowly disappearing because of the political and the managerial factors which are the real reason why the environment is endangered. The full potential wealth of the sea and its environment is still not very well known, and for this reason, more at risk of man's exploitation. You need to be well acquainted with the sea in order to work with it. It is necessary, therefore, to broaden the field of scientific research in order to single out and make use of marine resources with actions which are compatible with the environment to guarantee a sustainable development. In the province of Genoa, the local authorities, as well as public and private institutions, are working towards this goal and are committed to the difficult attempt to reduce the age-old cultural gap between the scientific and the economical and industrial worlds. Precisely because the sea equals life for the population of the Riviera, the preservation of the wealth of the sea and coast does not mean having to give up its resources, but rather working towards a development of activities which make man's presence compatible with the equilibrium of the natural ecosystems. It's all about uniting economics and ecology in the interest of the community. Only a greater sense of responsibility towards the coastal environment can safeguard this area, which is so precious to the survival of its inhabitants.